Certainly, unless Labour changes its offer, I think it's going to significantly lose a lot of potential Muslim votes. I think the story of this election is that the British Muslim vote can no longer be taken for granted.
Yahya Birt is a research director at the Ayan Institute in London. He's also a community historian and has taught at the University of Leeds. He's authored over a dozen peer-reviewed articles on Islam in Britain, and he's also authored Ummah at the Margins, the Past, Present, and Future of Muslim Minorities. And he joins us now from Bradford. Yahya Birt, thank you so much for speaking to us on Real Talk Online.
Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of talk about Muslim political engagement and how Muslims are going to be voting in this British election. So I think there's a lot that we can kind of get into and get the record straight. But I want to start off by asking you, on a personal front, how important do you think this election is for British Muslims?
Well, I think every election seems to be the most important, if you know what I mean. So we're all children of our own moment, of our own time. So once you've seen a few elections like me, you tend to be a bit more circumspect about saying this is the most important election. But certainly, Muslims have traditionally been Labour voting. And so there was an expectation after 14 years of Conservative government that there was a chance to turn over a new leaf. But the complicating factor, of course, which has been on all of our minds for the last 250 days or so, has been the genocide in Gaza. And that has created, a real tension, I think, about the relationship of the British Muslim community with the Labour Party.
What do you think is at stake for British Muslim voters?
Well, I think that the mistake would be to consider that the life and death issue of the Gaza genocide would be the only thing that would determine the voting choices of British Muslims. But it really depends when you do polls. It really depends what kind of questions you ask. So I know that there was an earlier poll by Survation, which was conducted by the Labour Muslim Network back in February. And really, it just asked how important, how would you rank the Gaza genocide as an issue? And 70% said it was very important. But that's actually not a very precise question. So if you ask a different question of ranking issues, what issues matter to you and how do you rank them, then a recent poll conducted by Savanta, which just came out a week or so ago, shows that actually Gaza is only the top issue for about 20% of British Muslims. It's a top 5 issue for about half of British Muslims. So other issues that are important to them, more important for them, are the NHS, the economy, the cost of living. So when you ask people to rank different issues, but obviously Muslims care a lot more about Gaza than, say, the general British population. So I think the question would be, how do we understand these issues? And because in activist circles we are very much focused on bringing the absolute atrocity that the Gaza massacre constitutes, it's understandable within activist circles that is a predominant topic of conversation. But we're talking here about the voting intentions of a population of 4 million people, only some of whom are of certain voting age. So then that polling will show a different picture compared to what exchanges go on WhatsApp, in activist circles or online.
Okay, well, we're actually gonna go into that in just a moment. But even if we just take a step back and kind of look at the history, I mean, from what we know, that Bashir Maan was the first Muslim to hold elected office in Britain in 1970. Mohammed Sarwar was the first Muslim MP in 1997. But if we take a look at the history of Muslim political engagement in the UK, what do we know from even before those times?
I think, without making it too long of an answer, I think the key kind of thing that this election of 2024 is highlighting is the most important thing about the history of our political engagement is that it's always been largely with the left of the political spectrum in Britain. And that goes back to the sort of, late 19th century, early 20th century, even when the Labour Party itself was in formation. But there was a very different set of issues that confronted a small Muslim community numbering maybe less than 5,000 at the time. But things like the anti-imperial struggle against imperialism, later on in the 20th century, the struggle for the rights of Muslim sailors and seamen, the setting up of workers' associations in the 1950s, like the Indian Workers Association, in the 1960s and 70s, the struggle for, against racism and the setting up of anti-racism movements. So there are always two wings, if you like, of the left in Britain. One was a kind of socialist wing, which tended to organize communities outside of party political structures, but had a presence in the Labour Party, and then a kind of an establishment wing of the Labour Party. Okay, so even within the Labour Party, you had differences of view on how to tackle racism, immigration, how to deal with imperialism and neo-imperialism during the Cold War. Labour parties traditionally sided with America during the Cold War, but that divided the Muslim world. Okay, so I'm trying to give you a picture of politics that goes beyond who was first elected to a position within a political party. So Bashir Mann, when he wins his seat in 1970 as the first Muslim councillor in Britain, he in the 70s he spent a long time galvanizing other of the first generation of post-war British Pakistanis, galvanizing them to actually join the Labour Party and even to consider running for office. So he did a lot of work in the 1970s and 80s as a kind of a history that is yet to be written. But it's notable that the first two, the first at Scotland has always been a kind of pioneer in this regard. The first MP was a Scottish Pakistani, the first councillor was Scottish Pakistani, and the first leader of a nation in Britain was a Scottish Pakistani. Okay, Hamza Yusuf. So Scotland has sort of led the way, if you like, for the rest of the country. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's always been a galvanization of British Muslims, both inside the party, outside the party structure through campaigning, and secondarily inside party politics. So you have to see it as having two dimensions. And this tension is very, very important. Even today, this is being played out. So there are parts of the left that are outside of Labour that are campaigning very strongly on Gaza. Marches, encampments, and things like this. And then you have the struggle inside the Labour as to whether or not the Labour Party can change its position closer to where most British Muslims feel it should be. And that is a struggle within the left. So this is trying to say they've always had this sort of two wings, the kind of anti-establishment socialist part of the left and a kind of establishment part of the left. But I think we can see that really with Keir Starmer we've reached a turning point. Okay, so this is the first time really that the Labour Party has almost completely jettisoned its socialist parliamentary wing. Only after Corbyn, so only a few MPs remain who are unabashedly socialist.
You're referring to what's been called a purge of the left by Labour.
There's been but I'm trying to point to the fact this is historically unprecedented. Tony Blair or Harold Wilson, previous prime ministers never considered jettisoning the socialist wing of the Labour Party, and because of its origins and its roots in trade union organising. So really, we're at a very potentially a big sea change in British politics. Could it be that not during this election, but maybe coming out of this election, would we see the formation of a new national party, a socialist party on the left that might appeal in the long term to British Muslims? And we don't know the answer to that question, but it's certainly a possibility. So we've had short-lived versions of that before, like the Respect Party that was around from 2004 to 2016. At its height, had 15 councillors, and it had, two consecutive victories in parliamentary seats with George Galloway. So, it's happened before, but it was short-lived. But arguably, that movement, which came out of the anti-war movement with against the Iraq War of 2003, it produced the Respect Party. It helped to produce the Aspire victory in Tower Hamlets in 2022, and arguably it helped to produce the Corbyn moment in Labour. It was one of the contributory factors that led to kind of an emergence of a kind of brief period of socialist leadership of the Parliamentary Labour Party. But again, as I said, we're now in a different period after 2020 where Sir Keir Starmer has really conducted a kind of purge of the left, of the socialist left of the party. So where that leaves Muslims, British Muslims and the relationship to Labour, I think is an open question, because it's always been the socialist wing of the party which led on anti-racism, anti-imperialism and workers' rights. It's those three things that have always appealed to British Muslims who, by and large, were amongst the more deprived part of the population, lived in inner cities, faced racism, were sympathetic to the independent struggles of their homelands through the 20th century. So those three issues had always been the kind of galvanizing issues that brought British Muslims towards Labour. And there's no reason to see why that would really change. I think you could add a fourth today, which is the protection of public services. So, if public services are not protected, I think a lot of British Muslims would find that to be a turn-off.
Well, you mentioned the Iraq War just a second ago. I mean, are there any other major issues in the past that have significantly impacted how Muslims voted in UK elections, like the Iraq War?
I think the Iraq War really is the outstanding example that we can draw on from our recent political history. So certainly, we had concerted moves within the Muslim community to kind of punish Labour for supporting the Iraq War, which led to respect. It led to tactical voting efforts that we're seeing now in 2024. And as I've said to you, it created a sort of a momentum, which I think you arguably led to kind of a change in the Labour Party itself, at least temporarily, with the Corbyn years in Labour, the creation of a separate party, Respect, and then the creation of an independent mayor in Tower Hamlets in Lutfur Rahman. So you can see actually that mobilizing outside party political structures creates quite significant changes within parties. And this is the problem, that we've had a kind of a failure of our political imagination. We define politics narrowly as party politics. We define political engagement narrowly as two things, either voting or lobbying. And actually, we have to pull back and understand actually that the greatest change comes from grassroots mobilization within communities over long periods. So workers' rights, the right to struggle against racism, so anti-racism movements, the struggle against imperialism, if you go back further in history, the struggle against imperialism and the creation of independence movements, which was supported by the early British Muslim pioneers in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. This is politics from the outside impacting politics within the party system, and so we have to have a kind of wider view of politics about where does change come from, and change starts from the outside, and it feeds its way slowly into the center with pressure and sustained effort. So we've got to stop thinking in a kind of Westminster Whitehall mindset, voting Westminster, lobbying, and Whitehall. I'm not saying we get rid of those parts of the democratic toolkit, but we actually need to have a wider view about campaigning in the grassroots and organizing outside. Community organizing,
Yeah.
we should say.
And how do you see the Muslim, I mean, with everything that you said, taking all that into account, how do you see the Muslim community reacting to Gaza with respect to elections? Is it different than they would have reacted to the Iraq War that we were just talking about?
I think that there are a lot of similarities, but the problem at this time is, I think, twofold, really. One is that back in 2003, there was a 2-year gap between the invasion of Iraq and the election in 2005. And so there was time for people to organize, create a separate political platform. Whereas this time, everything is compressed. The genocide began in October 2023, and Rishi Sunak has called a snap election for July of 2024. And what does that mean? It means that everybody is basically running to catch up. And so things are a little bit more, although there's similar forces at play, things are a little bit more disorganized this time. I think and that's inevitable because of time compression. I think the left is fragmented after the purge from Labour. And so I
You think the left is fragmented today?
is more fragmented because of the outcome of the purge of Corbynites from the Labour Party has left disorganized, a little bit disorganized, and then the time compression hasn't helped. And then you have attempts to coordinate the kind of the Muslim vote, but that's not really been able to be centralized. Although despite the efforts like the platform, like the Muslim vote, really the impetus has not come from the Muslim vote. The impetus has come from local campaigns who have by and large selected their own candidates, but it's sometimes been a messy process of not being able to get to a single independent candidate, and sometimes the opposition Labour vote has been split, right? So you're about 90 seats or so where Muslims are more than 10% or more of the electorate. Over 70 of those are safe Labour seats. So the question is really, what is the credible anti-Labour vote? Now, there's been a division in the community between sort of those who say tactical voting is the important thing. There are some Labour MPs who we like, who voted for a ceasefire, but that's created a sort of confused message. The message from the grassroots has been different. By and large, the message from the grassroots has been a clear anti-Labour. We're not voting for that Labour Party leadership, no matter what we think about the local MP. So there's been a push from the grassroots for a tougher line, and the kind of activist circles in London and elsewhere have tried to coordinate this sentiment from the grassroots has been to say, no, we should have a tactical vote according to the local constituency. That's actually been pushed aside by the grassroots. So I don't think this has been led from the centre. It's come up from the bottom up. And because of that, there's been some messiness, if you know what I mean. So in certain seats, you've had two strong independent candidates facing off against each other, like Preston or Blackburn. But in other seats where, say in Birmingham, Ahmed Yaqub or Lian Mohammed in East London, people have managed to or Ajmal Masroor in Tower Hamlets, you've managed to have people coalesce around a single independent candidate. But the first past the post system is quite unforgiving. So, you really need to hit a home run to overturn a Labour MP with a large majority. It's a really difficult thing to do, much more difficult than people underestimate how difficult it is. Even if you have a single candidate and you put your all-out effort on it, it's still going to be tough. So I would say that, independent sitting MPs, we've got 3 of them, George Galloway, Jeremy Corbyn, and Claudia Webb in Leicester East. So those 3 are in with a decent chance, a decent shot of retaining their seats, okay, even though Labour's throwing everything at them, okay. Other than that, I think it's, as I said, the 2 names I mentioned before, Lian Mohammed and Ahmed Yaqub, have both got a chance because there isn't a split vote. But, everyone's got their work cut out for them to actually break through. So I think we should have temporary expectations, and we should say, look, it's actually, let's look at the fact of the mobilization. Let's look at the drawing in of a lot of new British Muslims into community organizing, and even having a go at standing for office and learning about politics on door knocking and speaking at to hustings and things like that. A lot of people doing it for the first time, so it's galvanized a generation on a great issue of life and death, which is the Gaza genocide. And so let's say maybe this is something, even if 2024 has come a bit early for people to organize fully, it's maybe a platform, a momentum that can be built on.
Just gathering from what you're saying, so I mean, according to recent polling, and even when you speak to Muslims in the community, I mean, there's a very clear sense of betrayal or let down amongst British Muslims when it comes to how the Labour Party has reacted to Gaza. But I gather from what you're saying, do you see this more as just a temporary shift, or do you think it could be a bit more long-lasting?
I think, as I said, a lot depends on the fact that three things really matter here. One is that the purge of the socialist left out of the Labour Party. So that creates an opportunity for a new party to the left of Labour. Okay. But as I said, I think it's too early for that to emerge in this general election. So with a kind of national profile, because of the compression of time, you know, there's been a long-term trend in British politics, which is that, say, in 1951 election, 97% of the British electorate voted for Conservative and Labour together. By 2010, that was down to, I believe, 65%. So that the scope for third parties or alternative parties has increased, although it sort of slipped back a bit after Brexit. So alternatives, there's like the other thing that's changed is that, Muslim community is growing. So we've gone from under 1 million in 1991 to 4 million or so in 2024. So the British Muslims can have much more impact in terms of, where they are electoral presence in constituencies. So the scope has grown for alternatives. And so I wouldn't be so quick to say that this would just be a flash in the pan. Things have changed a lot since 2003. But again, a lot depends on, I think, will the right leaders emerge? Will there be a kind of genuine alliance between the socialist left and British Muslims? Can they come to an accommodation? Some of the things about the socialist left, there's still, if you like, difficulties in that negotiation. Quite often, British Muslims have felt that the socialist left view them, either as victims or as a vote bank, but they don't view them as full and equal and genuine partners. So maybe, the terms of that relationship have to be renegotiated to ways in which are more amenable to British Muslim communities. So all these things, all these different factors mean that are what are going to freight onto a realignment in British politics. I think there are bigger issues here as well. You can't create a new force in British politics. I think the issue really is also what the Labour Party will do. If there is over time a new electoral force on the left, which I don't think is going to fully emerge in this election, then how would the Labour Party respond if it remains blue Labour? Yeah, so a kind of austerity party. It doesn't look after its historic commitment to the NHS and education and social services and so on. A lot of bread and butter issues that affect Muslims. If it remains a staunch ally of Israel, then I don't think it's going to be seen as a home for many British Muslims. And they would support maybe a new party of the left. But again, all these things are, I guess, there are so many things that could happen. We don't know for sure. But certainly, unless Labour changes its offer, I think it's going to significantly lose a lot of potential Muslim votes. I think the story is that, the of this election is that the British Muslim vote can no longer be taken for granted, and I think that that's one of the
I
one
think
of
that's
the
one of the highlights, right?
the
Yeah,
headlines, yeah, one of the
sure.
headlines of this election.
And what do you think? And one group that you mentioned earlier was the Muslim Vote, which is a mobilization group, basically, who's asking Muslim voters to vote. That their voting should be principle based instead of traditional party voting. I mean, what do you think of groups like the Muslim Vote?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that they've offered some kind of information to local communities and some kind of logistical support. Um, and there's clearly more money um, attached to this effort than in previous elections. As I said, probably the most significant previous election was the 2005 election. So there have been efforts like this going back to the 90s around sort of tactical voting and voting for the interests of Muslim communities according to a sort of a checklist. So which party would meet this checklist of points? And they've been remarkably similar over the years. So it's not new. And the idea of tactical strategic voting as per candidate seat and so on, that's also not new. As I said, there was the idea back in 2005 to punish Labour for supporting the war in Iraq. And fast forward to 2024, it's just the same argument, isn't it? To
Mm,
punish Labour for not supporting an early ceasefire in Gaza. So it's not new.
right.
Um, but as I said, my analysis is, and others may disagree, but my analysis is that this effort's not led or strongly coordinated. The response from the British Muslim communities, really, it's been a grassroots um, effort, um, and the local candidates have largely been selected by local processes. There's been nobody from the Muslim vote appointing candidates. These have been, as they say themselves, I've talked to them, that they're
But they've been
endorsing.
endorsing candidates, yeah.
They've been endorsing candidates, have not been. So, in other words, this is a grassroots movement. Do you see what I mean? It's wrong to center the cord a kind of a website that provides with an organization that provides some logistical support. What you're seeing is a grassroots mobilization of local Muslim communities. That's the right way around to see it. And as I said to you earlier, that's why there's been some um messiness in some of the seats, like Blackburn and Preston, to give two examples, where you've had split votes because you've had multiple independent candidates. It's not been a tidy process for reasons I explained before.
What do you think of the framing of their name, the Muslim vote? Because the way the mainstream media has been dealing with it is I think they've been looking at them as if Muslim voting in the country is some sort of monolithic vote. And I think the way that they come off is that they are some sort of block representation of all Muslims in the UK. I mean, did you have any thoughts on how the framing of their title?
Well, I think that in a secular democratic politics, um, foregrounding your religious identity is always never going to be an easy sell to the party political system. Um, so this is even while they court it themselves. Yeah. So let's be honest, the quote unquote Muslim vote has been courted. Arguably, the Labour Party has become institutionalized in British politics. It has always courted the mosque. Yeah. And it has always dealt with quote unquote Muslim issues. So they invoke it when they need it at election time, but they don't like it to be too independent. So this has really been the tension. So when Muslims show independence of mind, all of a sudden their Muslimness becomes problematic. But when they feel that when Labour feels it owns the Muslim vote, then there's no criticism, you know. So I think that leaving that aside for one moment is always going to be a hard sell. And so this is why I would say, if you're trying to build a wider platform, so you go beyond, it is a life and death moment. It is one of the great moral um, challenges, tragedies, issues of the 21st century. This genocide, it is transformative because it's the first time that a people have live streamed their own genocide, and it's impossible now. I don't think any future genocide will be the same. I don't think it will be possible to do it in the same way. Genocides are normally done in the dark, and this one has been live cast. It's completely going to change our world. So it's unsurprising that it's shaken up. It's turned up domestic politics upside down. So but having said all of that and recognizing that and the weight of that, okay, um, we as a community, we can't just say that the way we'll mobilize our vote is only just in the interests of our community. I mean, if you wanted to create a broad, wider platform, we're always going to be seeking allies, to create a wider platform. And I think we have to recognize in 2024 that there is a great deal of politics of fear and fear mongering around Muslims and other people of color. So, in the last 10 years in Europe and now in America as well, we've had this idea of the great replacement. So the idea that somehow European cities are being taken over by people of color. We're being, it's like a reverse colonization, quote unquote. London has been lost, or Birmingham is a no-go area, right? You've heard all of this sort of uh, language of fear and hate mongering. And, we do have to think about ways to replace that. So replace a politics of the great replacement, a politics of fear and division, with a different vision for the city. Okay. So, in the last census, we can see, 42% of people in Bradford are Muslim, 33% in Leicester, 30% Birmingham, 22% Manchester, 15% London. Okay. So we have to stop thinking about ourselves as a minority and start thinking about ourselves as having a vision for the whole city, not just for our community interests. And this is, a politics of not of replacement, but of reestablishment, of recommitment, of replenishment of the city. We have to have a broader vision, and that is the platform we have to build as a community with allies and friends. And so I think that is a challenge. You can't expect the independents mobilizing on the Muslim vote. You can't expect them to kind of so you can't expect them, if they're coming from that narrow angle, to quickly find this other language, that inclusive language that I'm talking about. I do think the most capable candidates that I've seen coming from speaking from independent platforms are beginning to articulate this kind of broader vision, because they realize they're not going to win the seat on Muslim votes alone. So I think that to call something the Muslim vote is necessarily to hamstring the success of a protest vote against Labour. So I think some of the independents are realizing this, but without a national platform, they're going to struggle to cut through and to make their offer clear to the voters that they want to attract. This is why I'm saying that, we have to temper our expectations about this election, because we won't get the breakthrough necessarily that we're looking for. Obviously, we're all hoping for some successes, but even the fact of that mobilization, we can't allow it to become a sort of a kind of like a shooting star. It burns brightly for a moment and then disappears from the sky. We need something more permanent than that. And so we have to temper our expectations, have political discipline, and be able to see beyond this election to what we might build. Because we have to build for each city, for each constituency that we're in, hope for the future. And we've got to get away from the politics of division. And it's very, very disappointing that, the Labour Party no longer really seems to be the home for a kind of united politics of the city. And this is why I think we may be forced to articulate it outside of the Labour Party, given the direction in which the party has gone.
And when you see controversial and divisive figures like Nigel Farage, for example, coming out and saying like these initiatives are basically sectarian politics in the UK, that strikes you as what?
Well, he's going to say that because for the new the new right, the ethno-nationalist right, Nigel Farage is just one example. You can pick examples from every European country now, which are in the ascendant. Giorgio Meloni, for instance, or Marine Le Pen. There are other examples. So for them, there are two enemies. One is the elites, the elites who have globalists who have trashed our country and sold off parts of our country and threatened its sovereignty. And then you've got the internal, enemy, Muslims, people of color, the traitors amongst the quote unquote white community. So the enemy is always from at the top and also in society, and then you have external threats that they might identify. So this has been part of the same song, the same tune for quite a few years now. But we have to come out the other side of it. We can't placate it. We can't feed it. We have to articulate the alternative, and we have to work very hard to build alliances. So although I get that while the Muslim community needs to re-energize itself and motivate itself, we need to be looking beyond that to alliances. We can't just be articulating the needs of our Muslim community, which I'm not suggesting we ignore, but we need to articulate a common vision for our local communities and for our cities, at least as a beginning to articulating what direction we hope the country could go into. But we want a post-Brexit Britain that's at ease with itself. It's objectively the fact that we're much more diverse than we were before. Paradoxically, Brexit has meant that most migration from outside the UK is now coming from outside of Europe. That is not what the Brexit parties wanted, but that is the consequence of Brexit, to fill labour shortages. A lot of people coming from Africa and Asia now. So, Britain is objectively going to be more diverse. So we still need a vision for 21st century Britain that is inclusive and is not based on fear and division. And we need to articulate a common good, a common vision that everybody can feel a part of. And we build the country together, not in competition. That's what we need to get there somehow. And we need to articulate it. And our Muslim politicians need to be part of that articulation. They can't just be talking to their own community. That's the challenge that we face.
And as a final question, Yahya, I think looking even past 2024 and these elections, and I know it might be too early to even foresee this, but what do you think do you think we will witness changes in how Muslim voters and how Muslims vote in the UK, basically moving on? Do you think that this 2024 election will be some sort of change?
Well, none of us has a crystal ball.
Sure.
But what I will say is that, just as the Iraq War in 2003 was a political education for a whole generation of British Muslims, just as the whole 9/11 sort of securitization of the Muslim community, as a suspect community, tarnished as a collective with the stigma of political violence. Okay, that was formative for a whole generation of young Muslims. Okay. Similarly, the Gaza genocide is going to shape a whole generation. I don't think that the impact of that will be limited to one general election. So I think that there's a renewal of a kind of a politicization of that generation. It will galvanize people. And outside of elections, they will be involved in campaigns and community organizing, even setting up new organizations and mobilizing, creating new alliances, maybe exploring and articulating alternatives. It will be energized. And we have a very young community, so we underestimate the fact how much young people in our community drive a certain kind of political radicalism. And I know that radicalism has been a taboo word after 9/11, but I mean it positively. I mean a radical vision. You return to your core foundational principles. You engage a society of your day. You try to reimagine how they would be articulated in your time and place. So I don't see it as a negative thing. It's a return to principle and to see how those principles can be enacted in our own context.
And on that note, Yahya Birt, thank you so much for speaking to us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.